I'm holding the brand new Sony 70-200 GM version 2 lens ultralight. Look at what I'm doing with it, like one-handed, crazy. So I got this lens about 3 weeks ago from Sony, and it was just announced today, October 13th, 2021. But they give lenses to people. Every camera company does this with their equipment, so that the day that it gets announced that there's people that actually have some experience with it. So I got a call about 3 weeks ago with a super secret project for Sony. It was this lens. They gave it to a portrait photographer, sports, landscape photographers, and then they gave it to me and said, go shoot some wildlife with it. We want to see what you think of it as a wildlife photographer. So I'm going to share some pictures with you, and then I'll share the good, the bad, and just leave you with my overall thoughts. Does this stay in my camera bag? Is this going to be something that I'm going to use again for wildlife photography? So if you're into portraits, Miguel Quiles, he's another Sony artisan of imagery. Wonderful YouTube channel. I'm going to put a link to his video in the description because Miguel does a great video based on portraits. So if you are interested in that, make sure you go check out his video as well. So let's go jump on here, take a look at some photos before we take a look at some of the specifics on here, so you can just see what the lens was able to do. As I said, I photographed strictly wildlife and actually strictly birds with this. It didn't point at anything but a bird or a tree that had a bird in it at one point in time. So settings were my Sony A1, AFC continuous autofocus, manual exposure, auto ISO. I have the zebras turned on so I can do micro adjustments in exposure with my exposure compensation. Generally the lowest f-stop I could, and we'll talk about that as we go through the photos because there are times where I used a teleconverter. If you see a bird in action, chances are it was 1/3200th of a second. That's my go-to. And again, auto ISO. And then autofocus is usually either going to be wide if you see a photo of a bird in an open sky like this, or a zone autofocus area when you see something with a little bit more clutter or whatever it happens to be around that. Okay. And then as far as editing goes, just Lightroom basic cropping, tonal adjustments. And then the only other thing I did to them was I run Topaz denoise on just about every wildlife photo that I have. So great, I mean, perfect action. You can see it here. Great detail. These first group of photos were taken with the 2x teleconverter on. So 400 millimeters, which puts my aperture at 5.6. Anybody that says it's not sharp with a teleconverter, I would beg to differ here. So great performance all around, not just from the lens and the speed and autofocus, but also adding a teleconverter on there as well. Able to get super close, really do some isolation in it. But at the same time, it forced me to become more of a habitat photographer, where I might normally reach for my 200 to 600 and do super tight crops. I'm actually pulling back, and I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed including a little bit more of the foreground and some of the area around the wildlife in a lot of these different photos here. If you wanted to crop in tight, again, this was actually no teleconverter, but you can see just, great detail and everything. Shooting at 2.8 with wildlife, and when you can get close, almost has the appearance, if you shoot at 2.8 and you get close with a portrait, if you focus on the eyes, you're going to start to have the ears even go a little bit out of focus. And you can see that in a case like this. You can see the feathers and even some of toward the back of the bird starts to fall out of focus, while the beak and the eyes are perfectly sharp, which is a fun and interesting effect to go for. You can see the splashes of water, the little water droplets there. Great color, especially in the blue skies and some of the warm tones that we have in some of these photos here. Again, great at freezing the action. Autofocus picks up instantaneously. Working on those habitat shots, I can include a little bit more of the landscape around the bird. Also, having the aperture ring, which I'll talk about in a second. When another bird enters the frame, I'm able to actually quickly change the aperture. Still keep shooting with my finger on the shutter, but changing the aperture when I get multiple birds in there. But as I said, just, great backgrounds, great color, great everything. I was really pleased in how it performed. So when it comes to specs, I'm not gonna go into the super big details here because you can find all that stuff online. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about what stood out to me. Number one, the weight. I can't even describe it as a third less weight than the original 70-200. So if you're somebody that's going to hold on to this for a while, wedding photographer, sports photographer, and you're going to be holding this for a while, that third it's huge. I can't. I would pick up the old 70 to 200 and it just felt like you were picking up a couple of bricks. And it was widely known. Everybody, people would talk about that all the time. Optics quality was always great in that lens. It was just really heavy. It's like it's only a third, it's a third less weight, but that third makes the biggest difference in the world. It just totally changes the dynamics and how this lens feels. It went from being one of the heaviest lenses in its category to being one of the lightest lenses in its category. The footprint, the actual, the casing and everything, it's exactly the same as the original 70 to 200. The only thing that's different, the same size, same dimensions, same everything. The only thing that's different is it does have an aperture ring on it, which I really enjoyed. I didn't think I would enjoy. I actually really enjoyed it, especially when another bird comes into the frame. I'm switching between maybe slow shutter speed panning and fast action. Having my hand on the aperture ring and still being able to keep my finger on the shutter, it changes the dynamic. I didn't know I wanted it. And if I were to say two things that really stuck out with me about this lens is having that aperture ring and the weight. So I kind of want that aperture ring in my other lenses now. I found that I used it so much versus being able to just change the aperture with my shutter finger on the front here. It just came in really handy. So you're going to have the aperture ring, which is really the only noticeable difference between the two lenses if you were to look at them side by side. And then, of course, if you were to pick them up, the weight difference is going to be huge. As far as autofocus goes, one of the things that if you're shooting something like an A1, you need, if you want to take advantage of the autofocus and 30 frames a second and everything that goes along with that, you need lenses with fast motors and fast calculations in them. So this lens is what you would use for that. So if you're shooting something like the A1, you're getting more autofocus calculations out of it, which translates to faster autofocus, better autofocus, etc. If you're not shooting the A1, I don't think autofocus is necessarily a reason to upgrade to this. I think most people will probably upgrade if they had the previous lens to this one, mainly on weight alone is probably reason enough. Now I'm going to let the bad part dovetail into the answer of does this make it into my bag? Because they really go hand in hand. And let's just face it, what can I say bad about it? Like, it's a 70 to 200. It is a staple of photographers for decades. It's kind of hard at this point to mess it up. So if you're somebody that has the existing 70 to 200 and you've always thought it was too heavy, it's a no-brainer to upgrade to this one. If you're somebody that hasn't had a 70 to 200, then you just have to evaluate what you can do and what you want to do with it. So all I can do is give you my opinion as a wildlife/outdoor photographer. I'm going to have a wide zoom, 12 to 24. I'm going to have a mid-range, 24 to 105, and then I'm going to bring something long. For me personally, I'm probably still going to reach for my 200 to 600 or 100 to 400 rather than this, because I felt like I always wanted a little bit more focal length with this. Having a little bit less definitely did help with some of those photos there that I probably couldn't have gotten if I had too much lens on. But at the same time, I'm somebody that really likes that in-your-face detail personally. So I'm going to usually reach for one of those longer lenses rather than try to bring this and bring along a teleconverter. I'd still bring my teleconverter along and use one of the two lenses that I mentioned before and get even closer. Because for me, again, I always find I can never really get close enough. As I mentioned earlier, though, if you're into portraits, I don't like using my 100 to 400 for portraits. So this is an amazing portrait lens, and make sure you check out Miguel's video too, because he really dives a little bit deeper into that. Also, as I finish up here, if you are into Sony equipment, a while back I did a video on the Sony A1 and bird eye autofocus. If you've never seen it in action, if you want to learn a little bit more about what you have to do to make it work and how it can work, I've got another video here that you can always watch if you want to dive in a little bit more on that.